recording.
Hi, everybody. I see everyone's faces and a few not, but that's okay too. If you're in your jammies at this point in time, if you're in the Eastern time zone, it's 8 o'clock. It might be time for jammies.
I know, right? I know it's kind of late for you. That's why I asked you. I mean, it's late. 8 o'clock is late for me to be functioning, but
we'll see how the words come out this evening. You
right? Oh, funny.
Yeah, some people are just commenting on, hopefully you all did get the participant guide because that will help. And then Donna will be sharing the PowerPoint after this, but she'll tell you more about that. Caroline's got her puppy with her.
The handouts are coming from SOR Wisconsin.
I know I didn't get anything recently as of yesterday, Donna, because when I checked my email for this to find the Zoom, I hadn't gotten anything since you sent the initial letter.
Yeah, I sent it out yesterday around 3 maybe,
Okay.
with the attachment.
Okay.
What I'll do is I'll resend everything with tonight. I probably will be able to upload it tonight. And search for Science of Reading Wisconsin. It might have my name there too. Okay, well, that's unfortunate. A lot of people didn't get it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Don't know why.
Well, I've built in slides that have the questions I've asked on the participant guide, but we'll just want to make sure that everybody gets that afterwards. Yeah, that's too bad.
Did anyone get it? Oh, I got it. Somebody said I got it.
Is it possible to put a link in the chat to the document? And then we could open another tab, perhaps?
It's a document, so I don't know how that would, I don't know how to do that. If it's a document, let me look.
Can you download it as a PDF and then put that link in there?
I could. Let me think about this.
We'll have to save it as a PDF because it was in Word, but
Yes.
yeah.
I'll tell you what, let me do that after I introduce you.
Yeah.
And because I can do that while you're talking. I'm not controlling the screen anymore.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see if we can make this happen. Okay, it is 7:02. My tech support lady is helping me upload the PDF into the chat. Super easy. Okay, I gotta get the PDF. It was a doc though, wasn't it, Nancy?
It was a Word doc. You just need to save it as a PDF.
Right, I'll have to do that. Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight after a long day of work. We really appreciate that. We've been planning this for a couple months now, right, Nancy?
Yeah.
We're so glad that the day has finally arrived. Nancy's book, the Reading Comprehension Blueprint book, has been extremely popular and rightfully so. It's a book on comprehension that we all need so desperately to help our kiddos be better comprehenders. So Nancy is an educational consultant and past president of the International Dyslexia Association. She's an experienced teacher and administrator. While in public schools, she provided leadership in the development of professional learning systems and innovative programming for special needs students. Nancy has consulted on varied topics, ranging from professional practices to effective student instruction and assessment. She has designed and delivered keynote addresses, as well as virtual and live workshops and training courses for educators nationally and internationally. Nancy was a national trainer for the Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling, fondly known as LETTERS, and co-authored Module 6 of LETTERS, Digging for Meaning, Teaching for Text Comprehension, second edition with Louisa Moats. Her chapter, Working with Word Meaning, Vocabulary Instruction, can be found in the 4th edition of Multisensory Teaching of Basic Skills. Most recently, Nancy authored a book on comprehension, A Blueprint for Reading Comprehension Instruction, and here it is, Helping Students Make Meaning from Text. In 2011, Nancy received the International Dyslexia Association Margaret Bird Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award. And that is an honor to get that. Congratulations on that. So without further ado, I introduce to you Nancy Hennessy.
Okay, thanks so much, Donna.
You're welcome.
Donna, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share some insights this evening on comprehension, and I want to thank each and every one of the individuals who have joined this evening for their commitment to learning. I realize that everyone has had a busy year, probably a very busy day, and it's late, so I'll try very hard to be very interesting. But
it shouldn't be too hard for you, Nancy.
So following this evening, Donna will be sharing the PowerPoint with you, and hopefully you'll get the participant guide shortly. What I've tried to do is build in some opportunity for you to engage through that participant guide. Since there's so many of you online right now, it would be difficult to do this individually. But we will have some opportunity about every half hour to stop and reflect, for you to comment, to surface ideas, and to ask questions. Instead of waiting to the very end to do that, we'll do that, you know, three times throughout the presentation. You or provide to you just a little bit of background in terms of the book. I want all of you to know, first and foremost, I'm a teacher. I was in public school for many, many years. All those things that Donna just read, I was able to do because I'm old. All right. I've had some wonderful experiences. Well, it's true. All right. I've had some wonderful experiences in public school. And then following my retirement from public school as a consultant, working with, I was a lead Wilson trainer for a while. So I have that background, but also working directly with Louisa Moats. And it really was during that time that I became increasingly aware of the fact that I did not know nearly as much about comprehension as I needed to. I had spent many, many years very focused on word recognition, and that was an important focus and still is. But at the same time, you know, when we think about reading, I mean, really, what's the goal of reading? It's to understand and to learn, right? So yes, we need word recognition, the on-ramp, but we also need the processes and skills that are necessary to make meaning. And comprehension is far more complex than word recognition, and that's hard enough, as we know. So it was my work with letters that really spurred me to investigate, to think about, to talk with others, colleagues, teachers such as yourself, to read more, to interact with researchers, so that I became more, I don't want to say expert because I never consider myself an expert, but I became increasingly knowledgeable about comprehension. And along the way, I did have the opportunity to co-author with Louisa the second edition module for letters on comprehension. But also, I started developing a training called the Blueprint, believe it or not, for reading comprehension. And as I delivered that to teachers, they would say, "Where's your book?" And I was like, "Book? What book? I'm not going to write a book." That would be crazy, me writing a book. However, I ended up writing a book, and it really came from that work with letters, my interaction with others, as well as my increasing need to know more about comprehension. So that's a little bit of history. All right. So what about this evening? Let's move on. Well, tonight's session is really focused on what should we all know about comprehension. So this is very much going to be background knowledge. And for those of you who do have the book, what I'm going to do is highlight chapters 1, 2, and 3, all in about 75 minutes. So that should be interesting. All right. In session 2, the focus will be informed comprehension instruction. In other words, more practice. And what I'll do is I'll highlight chapters 4 and 5, which are on vocabulary and sentence comprehension. What you see represented here is that participant guide. So hopefully Donna's able to get that uploaded so that you have it, but if not, we'll support you as we move through the discussion this evening. Now, did you notice the caution tape? Right. I'm going to say some things this evening that you'll say, wow, I didn't recognize that or realize that. I'm going to say some things where you're, wow, that really affirms exactly what I'm doing. And I'm going to say some things where you're going to say to yourself, wait a minute, that's way too much at this time of night or any time right now. So caution, complexity ahead, all right? So we'll be talking about, for some of you, changing course by quite a bit, but we're only going to do that a few degrees at a time. So let's not get too overly concerned as all of this information kind of floods in, all right? Of course, I had to begin by talking about students. And I think, you know, as I wrote the book, and even when I do the blueprint training, I'm consistently thinking about how do we make connections to classroom? How do we make connections to students, right? And we all know that we have issues in terms of our students not achieving at levels that we want them to achieve at, despite all our efforts, despite some wonderful initiatives, all right? And so we have to step back and say to ourselves, well, maybe we need to change. We certainly know our children all have the right to read, and we all accept the responsibility to teach them. So I want you to begin to think a little bit about the students that you work with, or if you're not directly in a classroom, the colleagues that you are working with, dependent upon your position. And I want you to be thinking about what our expectations are of our students. Right? Antonia, first grade, listening to The Velveteen Rabbit. What do you think this means when a child loves you for a long, long time? Not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. Can Antonio answer that question? Have we provided the instructional supports that allow for him to dig deeply into the meaning of the text? Or Kayla in third grade, informational text, The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy. Why were the archaeologists surprised when they discovered the mummy? By the way, the mummy was female, right? And why would that be surprising? Or Matt in fifth grade, some of you may use this text, Tuck Everlasting. Would you want to be immortal? Why or why not? Or Lily, ninth grade, Animal Farm. In what ways does this fable serve as a condemnation of Soviet communism? What do we want for our children? We want when they come to text, that they're able to learn from their text, that they're able to dive deeply into the text, not just work at the surface level of the text. Okay, so how do we accomplish that? And that's what we're going to be talking about this evening and then again on Thursday. So let's connect. Let's connect with the science of skilled reading. Let's connect with the nature of reading comprehension, and let's connect with the reading comprehension blueprint. How do we go about constructing that comprehension house? What is that house made up of? What's foundational? What are the support beams and all of the other framing look like? What is it that we have to dig into in order for our students to accomplish what we call creating a mental model or an overall understanding of the text, a coherent representation of the text, they're learning from the text. And of course, in order for us to accomplish this task, we have to be thinking about ourselves and what it is that we bring to the task. So this is Louisa Moats, 2010. Expert teaching of It's not just the meanings conveyed by the language, but how the language itself works. Right. And then Snow, Griffin, and Burns a little earlier. Literacy is a secondary system dependent on language as the primary system. So effective teachers know a good deal about language. So this evening, what's going to be woven throughout our conversation is the fact that oral language is our base, right? But we as educators have to help our students make that transition from oral to printed language, right? And in this case, printed language that conveys meaning. And so I thought we would start with just a quick check on oral language, right? And so what you see here on the left-hand side are different systems of language. So it all begins with our oral language. And on the right-hand side, what I've not yet filled in for you are the connections to instruction. So we'll just do a few of these together and you can be thinking about this. And if you want, you could even put some responses in the chat box, and I know Donna will be monitoring. So when I think about phonology, all right, that study of what, how sounds work within our language, what instructional component might I make a connection to? And some of you, I'm sure, are thinking about word recognition, for instance. So you can go broader, you could be a little narrower, and you could say, well, phonics, right? Phonemic awareness and phonics. How about morphology? When we begin to think about morphology, the study of what? Those meaning units, right, within our language. Can we make an instructional connection to that? So I'll just go through each of these and you can be thinking about this or scripting it for yourself if you'd like. Semantics. What about semantics? Semantics has everything to do with understanding the meaning of word and phrases and even sentences. But what about syntax? Syntax has everything to do with understanding how we order words to convey meaning. And pragmatics has everything to do with how we use language to communicate in social context settings. And of course, discourse, a system of language that has everything to do with anything larger than a sentence. So each of these systems of language have connection to or are foundational to what we need to do in order to read proficiently, to different instructional components. So now let's take a look. So phonology, word recognition, right? Phonological awareness, decoding or phonics, spelling. What about morphology? Well, morphology plays into word recognition, certainly. But it also plays into vocabulary. Semantics, how does that translate over into skilled reading or reading proficiency? Reading comprehension, the understanding of word, the use in figurative language, and in writing, by the way, choice of precise words. How about syntax? Here's one that we don't talk a lot about, but in terms of reading comprehension, sentence comprehension. And not this evening, but on Thursday, I'm going to talk about sentence comprehension. And in writing, sentence construction. What about pragmatics? That's that use of language in social context. Well, for reading comprehension and writing both, it has everything to do with audience awareness and the use of dialogue and so on. And then last but not least here, discourse. And again, reading comprehension and writing, paragraph structure, genre, or the varied discourse structures that we use. Okay, so you will get the PowerPoint, so don't get too concerned if I'm moving a little quickly here. But I wanted to make the point that there is this wonderful language literacy connection, and we cannot forget about it. And it's particularly important, not only when we think about word recognition, but language comprehension is going to play a major role in terms of reading comprehension. Of course, we're talking here about the science of skilled reading, so how could we not talk about the simple view of reading? And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the simple view. Right? So Goff and Tummer in 1986, in a very well-known paper, right, published their findings in terms of, or I should say their theory, their model for how we arrive at skilled reading, AKA reading comprehension. And they propose that there are two factors, I think you're probably familiar with this, that are absolutely necessary in order for a student to be able to read with meaning, in order to be a skilled reader. One was decoding. We could also call it word recognition. The other is linguistic comprehension or language comprehension. We know that they're factors. So 1 times 1 equals 1 if we have a skilled reader. But if in fact we have a reader who's having difficulty, for instance, with word recognition, let's just assign it a value of 0, but they have good language, oral language, right? So they understand when it's read to them, 0 times 1 is still 0. It's not a skilled reader because they can't access the print, right, unless we provide the access for them. The opposite is true. Student has word recognition or decoding capability, does not have the oral language capability to understand what it is that they're reading, for instance, the meaning of words. So we have 1 times 0 still equals 0. So both those factors are necessary. This model has been in existence since 1986. Hundreds of studies based on this model have affirmed the validity of the simple view. Hoover, a colleague of Tummer's, so here's Tummer again, Goff wasn't involved this time, went on and further defined for us what each of these factors are. So I'm just going to give you a moment, all right, and let you read their definition for word recognition, beginning here at the bottom, all right, and then language or linguistic comprehension, and then reading comprehension. Take a moment to read that. All right, so word recognition, certainly that accurate and automatic ability to read the word so that you can understand what the word is conveying, the meaning of the word. Language comprehension, the ability to both extract and construct both literal and inferred meaning from what's being represented in speech. So we're not talking yet about the printed word, right? We're talking about oral language base. And then reading comprehension, all right, now what we're doing is extracting and constructing both literal and inferred meaning from print, from linguistic discourse that's represented in print. So when we think about the science of skilled reading, we first of all think about language, that language base. We think about this theoretical model that Goff and Tummer provided for us. And then of course, I don't know anyone who doesn't think about the reading rope. So this is Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. Now, I may say something right now that causes some cognitive dissonance, right? I know that I, among others, in the past have said that the reading rope is based on the simple view. It's not true. It looks like it's based on the simple view because you have those two factors. But I know right from the words of Hollis Scarborough, right from my conversations with her, that in fact, this is based on a meta-analysis of studies looking at being at risk for reading failure in young children. And while Hollis certainly acknowledges the simple view, and certainly we do have these two factors represented here, she will tell you that she did not base her reading rope on the simple view. She created this visual metaphor for parents and for educators as a way of explaining the complexity of reading. I'm sure you've heard explanations before, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but I will say this. Right. The lowest strands of the rope have everything to do with printed word recognition. Right? They are woven together over time, and hopefully our word recognition becomes automatic. We need to have an awareness of sound. We need to understand the patterns, right? We need to be able to become automatic with both regular and irregular words. Any one of those strands frayed, word recognition in jeopardy. The upper strands of the rope have everything to do with what? Language comprehension. Here comes the language again. Right? These upper strands include things like background knowledge, vocabulary. Language structures include semantics and syntax. Verbal reasoning includes inferencing. Literacy and print knowledge has everything to do with discourse structures or genre. These over time, woven together, become increasingly strategic. That does not mean strategy as we think of it. That means that the reader becomes increasingly cognizant of what their purpose is, what their goals are, and how they're going about accomplishing those goals. These strands woven together over time, right, allow for the student to make meaning. So when they come together, what do we have? We have skilled reading, that fluent execution and coordination of comprehension, and word recognition. Our conversation this evening, and again on Thursday, is going to focus on those upper strands of the rope. Here's a little something that I know I'll say later, but I'll say it now. Many really feel that reading comprehension problems, when we say students have reading comprehension problems, that's a misnomer. We should be saying they have language comprehension problems. All right. So Hollis just, amazing. That rope was published, certainly in a handbook on early literacy research, but she'd done a great deal of research prior to that. And actually, as I said, she shared that rope earlier with parents and educators. But in that very same handbook, here's what she said about skilled reading. Even if the pronunciation of all of the letter strings in a passage are decoded, the text will not be well comprehended if the child does not recognize or be able to read the words, cannot parse the syntactic and sentence relationships, lacks critical background knowledge. Note how she's talking here about those language comprehension capabilities. And then she says, note that in such instances, reading comprehension deficits are essentially what oral language limitations. So here's the importance of language once again. And then she talks about the fact that these processes that are involved in word recognition, those lower strands, have to become so well practiced that they proceed extremely quickly, almost effortlessly, so that they free up what? The reader's ability, cognitive resources really, for comprehension processes, for making meaning. Okay. So that was a quick read, and it was on your participant guide, but I read it for you. Okay. All right, I'm going to give you a moment just to take a look then at this descriptor of two students that will connect now to this conversation that we just had about the factors, the simple view, as well as the strands of the reading rope. Take a moment and read. So Jermaine, all right, is struggling with what? He's struggling with what Goff and Tummer call decoding, or what Hollis Scarborough has described as those lowest strands of the rope, were the word recognition capability. But he's able to listen, right? But he's not able to read words. So in a traditional sense, he's not yet attained reading proficiency because his word recognition isn't allowing him to get to the meaning. And the reality is with young children, okay, what happens is they're not able to access that meaning if in fact they can't read the words, right? Once they have word recognition, once that's in place, the dominant factor in terms of making meaning becomes the language comprehension components, right? What about Matt? Matt can read the words, but he's struggling with the language comprehension processes and skills that are necessary to make meaning. So he sounds like a skillful reader, but he's not. By the way, when Goff and Tummer first wrote about the simple view, they also wrote about the fact that the student who was struggling with word recognition skills typically would be called dyslexic, and the student who was struggling with the language component, the linguistic comprehension, would be considered hyperlexic, right? It's not a term that we use a whole lot any longer. We also have to acknowledge that there's a third profile that we could have described here, and that's the student who has difficulties with both. All right, so the first section of this evening had everything to do with talking about science of skilled reading, right? And During that time, we brought forwards for some students. We discussed very briefly the fact that we, as educators, have a need to become knowledgeable in the area of language systems and the effect of oral language on the printed word. And then we dove just very briefly into the simple view, the reading rope, right? And had some discussion about how do we become a proficient reader. So it's your turn. I promised there would be an opportunity for ideas, questions, connections. It's a check-in and check-up. So I think John is going to monitor for us the chat. And if any of you have a comment or a question, we can respond to that now.
So far, I don't see anything. So someone asked, does anyone have a copy or know how I might access the Simple View's entire text?
The actual, are you talking about the actual article, the original article?
That's what it seems like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I can send you a link to that later, Donna, and then if you
Sure.
can share it out. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. And you know, I have their article, but I also have a follow-up article that was written by Hoover and Tummer. So I'll send you the link to both those articles. Yeah.
All right, I'll make a note too. Simple View.
Oh, I see. Something about the Scarborough. I'm trying to look along here with you.
Yep. Do the notice and note strategies align with the blueprint?
Do the notice and note strategies align with the blueprint? I'm not quite sure what you mean by the notice, but the what I'm talking about now are highlights from chapters 1, 2, and 3, and from the blueprint, from the reading comprehension blueprint from the book. So I'm not certain if that's the question, but
okay, so yeah. Here, someone needs you to repeat. Could you please repeat when you were talking about Scarborough's rope? You mentioned not a strategy, but cognizant. I'm sorry, I missed what was said and was trying to get it down.
Yeah. So on Scarborough's rope, there's the wording attached to the upper parts of the strand, of the upper strands, that says strategic, and I think that's been misunderstood by some individuals to mean the use of comprehension strategies. And in fact, that is not what it means. Her intent there was that as readers over time, you notice that arrow running across the bottom, as readers over time become more proficient, they become more strategic. And by that, she means that they are thoughtful, metacognitive really, about their learning. So they're setting purpose, they're monitoring their understanding, seeing whether or not that plan that they have in place works or not, and then shifting if they have to. Now that may in fact include the use of different strategies, but it's not specific to the use of comprehension strategies. It's more about being metacognitive.
Okay, here's one. Should the focus in Tier 1 instruction in grades K through 2 be word recognition, reading foundations, and the focus for grades 3 through 5 be more language comprehension?
Okay, well, that's a good question, isn't it?
Mhm.
Certainly, we tend in the early grades to spend more instructional time on the teaching of word recognition. And there are different models out there that recommend different amounts of time. But I will say this, language comprehension has to begin in pre-K and kindergarten, first, second grade. So we can't wait until the students are in grades 3 through 5 to begin to focus on the language comprehension strands of the rope. And so one of the things this evening I hope we get to is I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of different texts. And so in the early grades, you're doing read alouds with your students, right? Well, you should be choosing read alouds that are rich in language, that contain what we call academic language. And I'll talk some more about academic language. You can't wait to develop that oral language that's necessary to work with more sophisticated, more authentic, rich literature, and then informational. passages.
How do we attend to the lower strands at the middle school level if they are obviously lacking?
Well, for those students who have not yet attained the word recognition skills, one has to put in place intensive instruction. These students need to be identified and they need to receive opportunity to develop word recognition skills while they continue to participate in their academic classes. And if they need access by ear through technology, then that's what they should receive. I was a middle school special education teacher, right? And then I worked in a regional high school district as the supervisor of special education. Our students in that middle school got OG. In the high school, they got Wilson reading, right? If they still were struggling, we made certain that they received the intensive instruction that they needed while they participated in academic classes, which they were capable of. Oh my goodness, I see the academic language throughout our day. Yeah, I could talk a long time about that. Well, certainly in the vocabulary chapter, I do talk a bit about how we can incidentally on purpose elevate our language. We have to, I think one way we can do this is by being cognizant of the fact that we need to speak in the language of our discipline. And even with our young children, so that happens all day long. And even with our younger children, we can be thinking about how we can incorporate $10 words into our everyday language. So, you know, instead of saying, let's line up, for instance, we can come up with, or it's time to go to the cafeteria, we can come up with more sophisticated language to represent kind of those everyday routines. But again, I want to emphasize the fact that our kiddos have to have access to age and grade appropriate texts beginning early on that contain rich language.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just maybe take one more and then
One
we'll go
more.
back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any pointers you could give for ESL students? The fact that ESL students may not have the same foundational skills in oral language as the other English speaking students.
Yeah. Okay. So when I speak to, if you can hold the thought, okay. When I speak to vocabulary and sentence comprehension, I will speak to that for students who are EL students who have language impairment. One of the things that I try to do in each of the chapters that are specific to these different instructional components is to talk about adapting for individual needs. So if you can just hold on to it. The other thing I would also highly recommend would be Elsa Cardena-Hagen's new book on EL students. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you. Those were great
Sure.
questions, good connections. All right. And let's see if we can move on. Okay. All right. So we've done the science of skilled reading. Let's do the nature of reading comprehension. And again, I've always got my Comprehension House here. You might have noticed by now that sort of looks like the upper strands of the reading rope. There's a few additions as well, but some of those strands of the reading rope are represented as being not only foundational, but in that framework for the Comprehension House. Okay. All right. So I'm going to come back to this idea that, you know, we have to have the knowledge base necessary to inform instruction. So what we know is absolutely critical. And so we have here, while experience is invaluable in and by itself, and that's sort of me over there on the left, lots of experience, all right? It does not provide necessary insights into the development of proficient reading. Now, I'm not going to say that experience doesn't count. It certainly does, but teachers cannot rely on their implicit understanding alone to teach reading. Explicit teaching requires explicit understanding, right? And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to really delve into what is reading comprehension. And so this is a quick write. This was on your participant guide. If you don't have the guide, maybe you can just do a quick script or take some notes in your notebook. I see some people furiously writing. And just in a few words, how would you complete this? Reading comprehension is. I'll give you a moment or two to do that. All right. So I'm going to share now with you a description of reading comprehension. But I want to acknowledge that before I do that, that there are multiple definitions out there for reading comprehension. The Rand Reading Study Group report, for instance, talks about it being the extraction and construction of meaning. The NAEP talks about it as being an active process. Is construction integration theory that talks about it as the integration and construction of meaning, and so on. I will also say this, very often when I ask educators to tell me what reading comprehension is, they'll respond with what I consider a product. So they'll say reading comprehension is summarizing, or reading comprehension is finding the main idea. And if in fact that's the way that you did respond, I want you to hold on to that thought. All right, because it's an important thought, but it really has much more to do with the product of reading comprehension. And I'm going to be differentiating between process and product. Why am I going to be doing that? Remember the upper strands of the rope? Language processes that are necessary in order to do what? To make meaning. Okay, so hold on. So here comes a description of reading comprehension that I'm going to pull apart. I'm going to tease apart for you. And this appeared in an article that was written by Ann Castles and colleagues, actually an article on ending the reading wars. Wouldn't that be great if that we could have that happen? All right. And it begins by talking about this as being not a single entity. But before we take it apart, why don't we just read it together? So I'll read it and you read aloud with me. All right. I won't be able to hear you. But I will be able to see your mouth moving if I scroll through the pictures. So everybody needs to participate. All right, here we go. Reading comprehension is not a single entity that can be explained by a unified cognitive model. Let's take a breath. Instead, it is the orchestrated product of a set of linguistic and cognitive processes operating on text and interacting with background knowledge, features of the text, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. Well, if you didn't think it was complex before, you might start thinking that it is now. And in fact, it is quite complex. This is why this description reads as it does. So let's see if we can't just deconstruct this a little bit. Well, what about that first statement about it not being a single entity and that it doesn't lend itself, to one particular unified theory, right? Well, this is Kate Nation's work. The ultimate goal of reading is comprehension, and comprehension is what we want the reader to reconstruct the mental world of the writer. And guess what? Because we're skilled readers, this feels pretty easy. It feels pretty effortless. And that comprehension kind of just moves along as we read along. But Kate Nation says to us, this sense of ease is misleading because it belies the complexity of what we do as we read. Multiple processes are occurring as we're making meaning. Even when the text is straightforward, a whole range of cognitive and linguistic operations are necessary. And we're going to delve into what those are in a few moments. So one of the things that immediately comes to mind for me is this misunderstanding that reading comprehension can really just easily be addressed by asking some questions or by identifying main idea. It's thought of as being just a single thing. And the reality is we don't even have comprehension measures that delve into the complexity of comprehension. It's not nearly as malleable, right, as word recognition or decoding is. And I think we have to begin from that perspective, from that point of view, particularly when we are working with students who are poor comprehenders. Okay. Well, it can't be explained by a unified cognitive model. Instead, it is what? The orchestrated product of a set of linguistic and cognitive processes. So now I'm going to invite you to think about, what does that mean? What's the difference between a product and processes? And I've given you a little bit of foreshadowing on that a few moments ago, right? So let's just take a moment, right? And let's take a look at this and read this to yourself in terms of the difference between product and process. So what are products? They're the indicators of what the reader knows and understands after reading. So very often when we think about reading comprehension, I think I did too when I was working with students. For me, reading comprehension was represented by what the student could do, right? That's the product. But what about these processes? How do you get to that product? Oh, the processes are the activities by which we arrive at the products. So I'm fond of saying you can't have a quality product without having quality processes. And I use this analogy in the book to describe what I meant. So I'm going to have you do a quick read on this now. Reading to yourself. All right, so as you're thinking about this, again, I want you to be thinking about linguistic or language comprehension. I want you to be thinking about those strands, upper strands of the reading rope. I want you to be thinking about different levels of language processing that one has to engage in order to make meaning. And what this is really saying to us, what the research has really said to us, what the science tells us is that if in fact our processes are flawed, then so will our product be. So here's some examples. I thought I should surface some examples for you of what I meant by products. So again, what we ask the students to do. And this is valuable in that we have to know whether or not we've accomplished our goals and objectives in terms of our comprehension lessons, whether or not our students are able to meet standards, whether or not they're able to perform on standardized assessments, whether or not they're able to answer questions in classroom, whether or not they're able to script responses as we work with them on a particular text. So some of the typical kinds of things that we ask them to do, all right, beginning again at the bottom here and throughout the book, by the way, there are examples of different types of texts for students at different grade levels. So you see Antonio, the Velveteen Rabbit. There's the same task that you saw represented early on. There's Jermaine, third grader, Dear Benjamin Banneker, or maybe the National Geographic readers, Rosa Parks, and questions about Benjamin, and questions about Rosa being a revolutionary or not. And then there's the mystery of the tattooed mummy for Kayla of fourth grade, but also Danutopia. So the responses to these questions then, right, are the products, right? The same thing here in terms of Matt, the one and only Ivan, fifth grade, Tuck Everlasting. Would you want to be immortal? Why or why not? Or Will in sixth grade, the founding of an American democracy. Why did the fathers have to compromise? Or there, it's Animal Farm again, as well as Stalin. So why am I spending some time here? Because one of the things that I'm going to emphasize throughout the blueprint and throughout this evening and next Thursday, or this coming Thursday, is the fact that we need to be thinking about how to develop these processes and skills. And while products are important, we have to be thinking about, do our students have the processes in place that are necessary in order to make meaning? So there's the language processes, all right? So again, we've said, here are our products, right? This is the outcome, right? What are the processes? What are these linguistic and language processes, cognitive processes? Well, we've already identified the language comprehension strands of the rope, but we also can turn to the work of Kane and Oakhill. And if you don't know Kate Kane's work or Jane Oakhill's work, they're from Great Britain. And they've done a great deal of work in the area of comprehension. And here's what they say. At the word level, the reader must decode individual words. Yeah. But what about language? They have to access the meaning of the words they hear or read. Yeah. So there's your vocabulary. At the sentence level, the comprehender needs to work out the syntactic sense of each the syntactic structure or the sense of each sentence. Now, when you talk about the reading rope, language structures, you're talking about semantics and syntax. But simply deriving the meanings of the individual words in the sentences is insufficient. In order to construct a mental model, and I'm going to talk more about what that is, but I would just say to you, which our overall understanding of the text, the comprehender has to do what? Integrate information from different sentences. Within and between sentences, we have to see how those idea units link up. But they also have to integrate their background knowledge, another strand of the rope, to make sense of the details that are only implicitly mentioned. So when we think about that definition or that description of reading comprehension, right, we're saying not a single entity, right? We're saying the orchestrated product of processes, language processes, as well as cognitive processes, and then interacting with the reader, the text, and the task. And we're getting there in a moment. But the important piece right here is to focus on these language processes that are so necessary. All right, what about that interaction? Okay, operating on the text, interacting with background knowledge, features of the text, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. Well, this sounded pretty familiar to me, and maybe to some of you. Some of you probably know about the RAND Reading Study Group report heuristic, which is a model, right, in which they surfaced some of the other dimensions that affect reading comprehension, right? Reading comprehension doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? It involves the reader, right? Who brings what? Language, cognitive, executive function, or not, these capabilities. It involves the text. The text presents with its own challenges. We all know about different text difficulty, lexiles, right? Measures such as cometrics that have everything to do with the level of vocabulary, the syntax, etc., that's used. We also know that task can affect how we go about working with the meaning, right? So we adjust to the purpose, and we know that there's a context in which reading occurs. So if we were to think a little bit more about this, good comprehenders have cognitive capacities, attention, memory. They have motivation, purpose for reading, an interest in the content being read, sense of self-efficacy. And they bring these varied types of knowledge, vocabulary, domain, topic specific, and so on. So the reader is coming to the text, right, with these varied capabilities. It can be difficult or easy, again, dependent upon the factors within the text, the vocabulary load, the linguistic discourse style, the genre, right, text complexity, right? And while reading, our reader has to do what? They have a purpose in mind. Remember that strategic piece that I was talking about, right? And so skimming, for instance, getting the gist, is going to tap into different processes than studying, reading the text with the intent of retaining the information for a period of time. And of course, then there's the context. And we, as the educators, are the context, the instructional context. There's a broader context as well, right? But we are the instructional context. All right. So I wanted to pull this together for you, all right, because I know this is a lot to think about in terms of that very simple statement, reading comprehension is, right? I wanted to pull it together in terms of the reader, the text, the task, right? And what it is that we're asking students to do, right? So when we think about the reader, right, we see her in the upper right-hand corner, coming to the text, in this case, Tuck Everlasting. It could be an informational piece of text as well, right? He or she, right, is given a specific assignment. And if in fact, right, It's an assignment that is reflective of some of these higher levels of understanding that we are asking our students to do. Then they're going to have to work with the words, right? The meaning of the words. By the way, the words are going to be academic in nature, not everyday language. Remember, I said something about that translation moving from oral language to print, right? So academic vocabulary, breadth, depth, precision. Oh, I think on the reading rope it says something about breadth and precision. Sentences, right? When in fact we're using, let's say, literature with young children, right? Children's literature, or when we're using expository text, or when we're using books such as Dear Benjamin Banneker, right? Our sentences are going to be dense. That means there's more than one idea in a sentence. They're going to be long. They're going to have varied structures, and they're going to be tied up with meaning using something called cohesive ties and connectives. They're also going to require knowledge, schema of the specific topic, and by the way, text structure. That's a part of your background knowledge. And we're going to use that to do what? To make inference. And as we flow back and forth, this kind of dynamic relationship between the reader, the text, and the task, right? Ultimately, we're wanting our reader to arrive at this mental model or a coherent representation of text, an understanding in which all the ideas hang together. This is very dynamic in nature, right? They move from what's called the surface code, the exact words and syntax the author uses, to the text-based integrating background knowledge to ultimately this mental model. So now I think you can see why I call this comprehension not so simple, right? If I layer on top of this, someone had to be thinking, what is she talking about all these language processes for without talking about cognitive processes? All right, certainly we can speak to executive function and so on, but Judith Irwin has given us a window into this and said that as the reader uses their language capabilities, they're engaging in microprocessing. They're looking for those idea units. And then they're integrating those idea units within and between sentences. And they're thinking about their own thinking, metacognitive, monitoring their comprehension. And they're elaborating on what they've read, integrating background knowledge. And they're arriving at an overall understanding, macro processing of the text itself. All right. So proficient readers construct this integrated representation of meaning rather than an exact record of specific words. They create a mental model, they intertwine background knowledge and so on, and they aggregate these successive units of meaning, right? Think about the rope, right? Think about the way in which we're weaving together over time, how we're aggregating meaning and building toward an overall understanding of the text. And that should always be the goal for our readers, to recreate that mental world that the writer represented. When a child is not successful, when a child is unsuccessful in comprehending what he or she has read, it suggests reading difficulties where? At the processing level. And these difficulties manifest themselves in what we would consider products, right? Main points, literal questions, inferential questions, and so on. And here's what I alluded to earlier. Individuals with reading problems and reading comprehension that are not attributable to poor word recognition have comprehension problems that are that are more specific to what problems with language comprehension. Okay. So now let's go back to your definition for a moment. All right. Reading comprehension is, and I'll give you a moment to do a quick revision on your participant guide and to just take some brief notes about what might you add to your original description of reading comprehension, perhaps 1 or 2 points. I could also say to you, in what ways did your mental model change? Okay, I see some interesting comments in the chat as well. So if comprehension is a product of word recognition and language, then making connections through academic content language while teaching the code will open up or unlock the understanding. Reading comprehension is being able to read the words and understand what they mean and connect content to prior knowledge. Yeah, cool. All right, all right. And this comprehension is talked about in top 10. Yeah, I know Deb Glazier. Yeah, great. Wonderful training. And I need to get more granular in my instruction. Yes, Melissa. Okay, and yes, the Cain and Oak Hill book is a very good resource for those of us who are talking about comprehension. Okay. So that's what I've seen so far. All right. Oops. Okay, guess what? It's time for your ideas, questions, comments. Again, here's our comprehension check in and check up. Let's see what you want to put in the, and if you want to just add anything that you're taking away in terms of the complexity of comprehension or that you've added to
Here
yeah.
was one.
So-
So if comprehension is a product of word recognition and language, then making connections through academic content language while teaching the code will open up or unlock the understanding.
Yeah, yeah. So certainly working across content areas is important for our students. The use of academic language is important. That consistent development of those language comprehension strands, both in narrative and expository text across disciplines is critical.
Okay, are there ways we teachers, parents can increase background knowledge? And what would be an example of academic language to ask the children to go line up?
Well, how about cue? Let's cue up. You could use different words for walk, let's walk quietly, let's walk silently, let's saunter, let's stroll. So yeah, things that we could do with students with that. The background knowledge, there is a chapter in the book on background knowledge, and I call it the tool that I have within that chapter is called the ABCs of background knowledge, and the focus is on A being that you activate and assess whether or not children have the specific background knowledge necessary for the text that you're working with. And then the B, if in fact they don't, the building of background knowledge, and then the C, connecting what it is that they're reading to their background knowledge so that they can make inference. And I mean, there are different ways that we can do this, different tools that we can use, but certainly many of you, I'm sure, when you build background knowledge for your students, well, we can activate through anticipation guides, for instance. Agree, disagree with statements that we bring forward from the text itself, for instance. For building, we can use virtual visits. We can create experiences. I mean, there are any number of things that we can do. Maybe we can share a little bit of that next time as well. But that is an entire chapter that's dedicated to just that. I love it. Boys and girls get in two parallel lines at the door. Yahoo! All right.
This is
Yeah.
from Meredith. Are we able to assess the processes of comprehension, or do most measures we use only measure product? What should we do?
Yeah, most of them are looking at product. One of the things that I've included in each chapter in the book as well is classroom-based assessments that kind of get at each one of these. So for instance, in the chapter on vocabulary, and next week I'll share an example of that, or next week, I'm sorry, on Thursday, I'll share an example of that with you. But I think that we don't have very many formal measures that really kind of get at whether or not the students have the vocabulary. Do they understand the syntax? Do they understand how to integrate the meaning within and between sentences? Do they have the background knowledge? Are they able to make inference? And I think oftentimes our classroom activities form a very good basis for thinking about informal assessment. And so I've created some charts in cooperation with colleagues who are in the classroom to do that. There is a very nice diagnostic that Acadians also has published. It's a short diagnostic. It's called the CFAL CFOL, Comprehension Fluency Oral Language, that I think serves a nice purpose in terms of looking at some of these processes. Okay.
All right, we have one here. Where would you recommend starting intervention with a child who struggles to comprehend?
Vocabulary.
Mhm.
All right. A heavy emphasis on vocabulary and background knowledge. Certainly, there are other components or processes that I'm talking about, or skills that I'm talking about here, but it's really critical to be able to understand the words that you're working with. And so beginning with the vocabulary, I think, is critical.
Mhm. And I think we got one more here. Will we be talking about good ways to assess processes versus products on Thursday?
Well, on Thursday, we'll be talking about vocabulary, and we'll be talking about sentence comprehension, and I'll share then some informal classroom-based assessments that you can use for looking at whether or not students have a breadth or depth of word meaning, as well as whether or not they understand how to take a sentence apart, answer questions like who or what is or was doing, what, when, where, how, and why, and also the use of cohesive ties. Okay, let's take one or two more if there are any others.
No, just a comment from Kelly that speech and language pathologists can help us with assessment of language comprehension. That is so
Yes, and
true.
thank you, Kelly, for bringing that up. Certainly, I hadn't thought about that, but speech and language do have varied assessment tools that can tap into these language processes. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's move on. Okay. And finally, the reading comprehension blueprint, huh? So you had to be saying to yourself, what is the reading comprehension blueprint? She's done a lot of background knowledge here in terms of skilled reading and the nature of reading comprehension, but what in fact is the blueprint? Okay, but we're going to begin with this question, okay, and this was in your participant guide. What do you believe is the most effective approach to comprehension instruction? So why don't you take a moment and do a little bit of scripting for yourself before I get into the blueprint itself. What do you think is the most effective approach to comprehension instruction? All right. I'll just take a few more seconds to finish thinking about that or scripting. All right. Now, at the very beginning, I said something about causing some cognitive dissonance or confusion or affirming or asking you to change course. So I just wanted to clarify before I go any further. I realize that I'm talking about a different way of thinking about comprehension for many of us. Perhaps not for all of you, but for many of us, this is a different way of thinking about comprehension. So I want you to be thinking about the fact that for some of us, we can change course just a few degrees. Others can change more, but this takes time. All right. This is a rethinking of how do you use what you currently have, your curriculum, and how do you consider, the context and your students in terms of making changes. So I'm asking you to consider a process rather than a product-oriented approach. I'm not saying the product is not important. I'm not saying you don't want to get to the product, but rather than always be thinking about comprehension as, oh, I have to identify the main idea in details, or I have to make a prediction, or I need to write a summary, rather thinking about, well, what does it take? What processes or skills are necessary for the student to be able to do that? So beginning with a framework that directly addresses the development of these language and cognitive processes and skills, and acknowledging those theoretical models that address these processes, right? And using the framework, the blueprint, we're going there in a moment, as a starting point, right, for instruction. Not in conflict necessarily with your curriculum, but rather an opportunity to enhance it, right? And always thinking about what your context is, what your current curriculum is, and the students that you have. So I'd love for radical change, but I also am respectful of where each of you live and work, and understand that the context very often will demand certain things of you. So we want to change course, but we're respectful of the fact. Sometimes I say, you know, this is, I put a little elephant. I don't love this analogy, but I put an elephant on the slide and say it's one bite at a time. Okay. All right. So the reading comprehension blueprint. What is it? Well, it's a structured approach to reading comprehension. It's based in the science. It calls attention to the fact that comprehension is about learning, about understanding. So we should be thinking about what are the critical understandings that we want our students to walk away with from text. Not just literacy skills, right, but also content knowledge. We also need to be thinking about the readings that we're using with our students. And if our readings effectively, and or can we elaborate or supplement, right? And then, of course, the use of evidence-based strategies and activities. So what is the blueprint for reading comprehension? Okay, this is a quick read. So again, I'm going to give you an opportunity. If you have your guide, you can read from your guide or from the slide. Take a moment and read. All right, let me just quickly review with you some key points about the blueprint. One, it's a master plan. It's not a lesson plan. It's not a unit organizer. It's a framework, right? And it's based in the evidence, and it accommodates for both process and product demands. It's a way of organizing and scaffolding your preparation of text. And it does call for evidence-based routine strategies and activities. It allows for flexibility dependent upon the text, the student, the task, and the context. And it acknowledges that, in fact, teaching is a metacognitive act. And it does that through a series of questions, right? So this then is the blueprint. And in the participant guide for Thursday, there's a copy of the blueprint as well for you. I didn't include it in this particular guide. All right. So let's just take a look at this, and let's just take it apart a little bit at a time here. So if we look at the left-hand side of the blueprint, we come over here, we see preparing for instruction. So the first part of the blueprint really asks us to begin to think about these critical understandings or big ideas that we want our students to walk away with. And so there's a series of questions then on the right-hand side, all right, that prompt us to do just that. What do you want your students to know and understand after reading the text? What are the big ideas you want your students to acquire? What text will support that? Right? And then, all right, preparing for instruction, purpose for reading. What are the content instructional goals and objectives? And what are the literacy instruction goals and objectives? And again, I want to make a point that We shouldn't just be thinking about, oh, I want my kids to acquire vocabulary, or I want them to be able to understand sentences. Those are certainly important, right? But I also want them to learn something, to know something. Comprehension is a medium for understanding. It's really all about learning, right? So we need content, instructional goals, and objectives. And then we come to the text reading part. And as you take a look here, this should look familiar to you, because what you see represented, right, are the strands of the reading rope, but also those levels of language processing that Kane, or Oak Hill, Kane, and Elbrow talk about. So you have vocabulary, you have language structures, phrases, clauses, sentence comprehension, so the syntax. You have knowledge, both text structure, because remember I said that's a type of background knowledge, and background knowledge, more like schema. And then you have levels of understanding and inference, which is represented by verbal reasoning on the rope. But within Oak Hill, Kane, and Elbrow, or Kane and Oak Hill's expression of levels of understanding, they talk about this integration of meaning within and between sentences, and then this integration of background knowledge that allows for inference. And then last but not least, I've added expression of understanding. There's your product. What strategies and activities, etc., will allow for that. On the right-hand side, you have questions that prompt you in terms of your approaches to instruction. And these questions are all based in what? The literature. They're based in the science. So which words will your students need to know, which are worth knowing? Which ones will you intentionally target and directly teach? Which ones will you incidentally teach? Which words will you purposefully discuss and incorporate into expressive language? How and when will you teach and foster the use of independent word learning strategies? That represents the approaches that we know are based in the evidence for vocabulary instruction. And we have that for each of these. And then we have a bidirectional arrow, which says to us, you know, this flexibility that I mentioned a few moments ago, where will you do this, before, during, or after? Right? And which strategies and activities will you choose that align with the evidence? And of course, we want our students continuously monitoring their comprehension. So the blueprint, again, all right, is a framework. It's not a lesson plan, although you can derive a lesson plan from it. It's not a unit organizer. You can derive a unit organizer from it. And in fact, in chapter 9 in the book, we do just that. But this sets the stage for thinking about comprehension is complex. It's based in language and cognitive processes that allow for products. And how then do I use what the science has told me in order for my students to integrate across text all of these different processes and skills so that they can make meaning? All right. So in the remaining time, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time. I'm watching the clock. It's getting late. I'm going, which is preparing for instruction, right? So preparing for using the blueprint, identify the deep knowledge base, identify the text, identify the purpose for reading. Let's see if we can move kind of quickly on this. So by critical understandings, I'm talking about these big ideas, these enduring understandings. You know, we want our students to have this opportunity to take something away from their reading. And that we have a quote here by Tim Shanahan that says, you know, too often the emphasis is on the skill, right? And we lose this opportunity to understand the world through our reading, right? So one of the things that we want to think about in that comprehension house, you see foundational, is what is it that our students are walking away with? What is the critical understanding? And can we think about this across discipline? Because sometimes we can make connections across discipline for our students in terms of big ideas. And I thought you might like to see an example. Now, I know that for some of you, these are within your curriculum and you have to surface them and think a little bit about how they make connections and how the texts that you're using are supporting these big ideas, this knowledge base for your students. But for some of you, you also might have opportunity to participate in building curriculum or designing curriculum. And this is an example from a teacher who has worked with her team, right? And they have identified across grade levels, right, the texts as well as the critical understandings topics that they want to focus on for their students in grades 1 through 5, right? So you see, for instance, we'll just look at grade 1, life lessons. The enduring understanding stories can teach us important life lessons, and then some essential questions. How can stories teach us lessons? How do story elements of character setting and problem solution contribute to stories? What did this story teach us? You go all the way over to grade 5, we have coming of age, right? And we have enduring understandings and then essential questions. So the point here is to be thinking about the fact that when we are reading for meaning, right, we're reading for understanding of a particular concept, idea that we take with us. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that the readings that we're using, right, provide opportunity for the development of academic language. And someone asked a question about that earlier that I think this will help answer, right? So we want our readings to be supporting the development of that academic vocabulary, more complex syntax, building background knowledge, helping students infer, and so on. Okay. So thinking a little bit about, does the reading provide this opportunity? What readings reflect the knowledge base? Do the readings represent this experience of the reader? And we have to be, I think, sensitive to that. Different genre, disciplines, and integrated approach. So we don't want our students just hearing initially and then reading narrative text. We want expository, informational text. We want different topics and so on. All right. So, oh, here was a true false for you. So let's just see. Academic language is very similar to our everyday language. Just think for a moment, all right? I think this was on your participant guide. Is that true or false? You know the answer. Whoops, it didn't work. Yes, it will. Incorrect. All right, correct. It's false. Okay. All right. So here's an example of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about academic language. I'm talking about the fact that the vocabulary words are not the words that we use in everyday language. They're more sophisticated. Oftentimes, they're going to be of Greek or Latin origin. Okay. We're talking about syntax, right? Not just simple sentences, but simple sentences maybe with more than one subject, more than one predicate, with embedded phrases or clauses, right? Maybe sentences that have more than one idea in them, sentences that are long, right? And so on. Okay. We're also talking about the use of different discourse structures. So yeah, we can talk about narrative and expository text, but start thinking about all the variations. You know, if you talk about narrative text, you're talking about fables as well, right? So you're talking about what? Historical fiction. I mean, you can start thinking about all the different types or nuanced versions of discourse structure. So academic in nature. So let's just take a look at these. Read the first one to yourself. So you're noticing words like astronomy, almanacs, calculate, right? And did you notice the sentence structure? Just take a look at that last sentence. But it didn't occur to them, a black man, free or slave, there's an embedded phrase there, could be smart enough to calculate the movements of the stars the way Benjamin did. Take a look at, let's go to the last one because our time is limited. Read that one to yourself. So the very first one was Dear Benjamin Banneker, around 3rd grade. The middle one is the one and only Ivan, around 5th grade. This last one is 8th or 9th grade, okay? It comes from Common Lit. And of course, this is informational or expository text. And did you notice something about the sentence structure? How many sentences do you see there? It's just one, all right? And then you have words like genocidal, ruthless, steely, right? Perhaps hardships, imprisonment, exile, fomenting. Okay. So academic language is not the language of every day. It's the language of school. It's the language of the workplace. It's the language of standards, and it's more sophisticated. And our children need to be hearing that language early on, right? Not, as someone asked a very good question, not beginning in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, but from the time that they come to school with us. Decodable texts are wonderful. They serve a purpose, right? For practicing pattern, becoming proficient at word recognition, right? But their purpose is not the development of language, right? We need to be using authentic texts across disciplines, texts that represent these different genres, right? So that our students can develop this academic language. Marilyn Adams says to us, giving children easier texts when they're weaker readers denies them the very language and information they need to move on. And Shanahan also reinforces for us the fact that kids who are struggling with guidance from teachers can, in fact, make sense out of, can handle, right, text that is designed for kids at their respective grade levels. We need to give them the access, maybe by ear, for some of those kids still struggling with word recognition. Now, I'm moving a little quickly here, but that last enduring understanding was coming of age, 5th grade. And these are some of the books that might be chosen that represent different genre across discipline in order to work with that particular critical understanding. So I had a reflection for you that I included in terms of thinking through for yourself, your readings that you're currently using. Is there a way that you can expand on, supplement those readings that you're currently using, thinking through, are there some big ideas that are being conveyed, and can you enhance the it? Can you enhance the curriculum, and keep thinking about readings? Okay. All right. And I'll just do this one more, and then we'll move to ideas, questions, and comments. This very last one being, and I think I've reinforced this enough now, acquiring knowledge of critical topics, including enduring understandings, constitutes content goals, whereas the acquisition of critical language skills provides the basis for formulating literacy goals and objectives. So things like developing vocabulary, developing sentence comprehension, developing background knowledge, working with questions at different levels of understanding, giving students different opportunities for expressing their understanding, right? These are our critical language skills, but our content goals and objectives have everything to do with those big ideas, those critical understandings, right? Don't forget about the bidirectional arrow. Maybe we'll revisit that next time. I was going to do that now. Let me just go here. So session 2, when we come to session 2 on Thursday, we'll be using the blueprint to construct informed comprehension instruction, but we'll be very focused on vocabulary, and we'll be very focused on sentence comprehension. And in each of the chapters, all right, we connect to classroom, we connect to comprehension, we define and describe, we talk about instructional practices, adapting to individual needs, and informal assessment. And some of you asked some very good questions this evening that relate to some of these things. So we'll make a very hearty attempt to answer all of those questions. So this was thoughts about the blueprint, but I think what we perhaps should do at this point in time, before I go to gratitude, is give you an opportunity again in the last 2 or 3 minutes to see if there are any thoughts about the blueprint, or if you have questions or comments or ideas. Let's see if anyone's surfacing anything. Someone said, thank you, see you Thursday. See you, Maureen. Anyone else?
If anyone wants to unmute, you can do so.
Yeah. Oh, good. Thank you. I'm an SLP. I rarely administer Reading comprehension, I assess all things that could interfere. Okay, yes, and speech and language helping out. Yes, by all means, unmute if you'd like.
Melissa asks, is it difficult to make the shift to process, and how?
You know what? I think it just takes time, and it takes support in terms of understanding what some of the strategies and activities look like in order to do that. I don't think it's ever easy to change what it is that we're doing, but I think when we have support and we have information, when we have resources, we're capable of doing so. The difficulty may be your context more than your willingness. So.
It's hard because, you know, like I do article of the week and I do them almost every week. And 1 week we break into stations and we talk about textual evidence and supporting our opinions because they need to be able to do that on standardized tests. And then the alternate week, I have an article that is on the same topic so that they can develop some background knowledge about something going on in the world. And I have them, you know, speak it into the universe so they don't have to spend 2 weeks writing and they generate a 1-page argumentative. And I'm just trying to think, okay, how can I tweak? How can I tweak this assignment?
Yeah. What grade level are you working with?
Well, so I'm holed up for safety purposes teaching virtual kindergarten right now, but next year I will return to my kindergartners with beards, as I affectionately refer to them, to my 8th grade general class. And I get a lot of kids. My kids are the ones that are broken, that don't think they can, that many of them read on a 2nd grade level, some on a 6th grade level. And I just kind of with fierce determination have said, okay, so you can't read that well. You can still think, let's go. But I realized that's not enough. Just brute force is not enough. And that's when I enrolled in the Mount St. Joseph Reading Science program. And so I have an assignment. I have a discussion post on your book due Thursday. So.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think in terms of if you're using an article of the week, I think you can target the article for different processes and skills each week.
Okay.
And you know, I think that, you know, looking at vocabulary maybe a particular week, background knowledge another week, just continue to integrate. And I think preparing the article, looking at what's the most challenging thing about the article, and that will give you direction in terms of what skill, what process you want to focus on. You know, oftentimes sentence comprehension is really difficult for these kiddos, and so even pulling out sentences ahead of time and having conversation about how the words work within the sentence, doing mini lessons, you know, on the grammar. And then using examples from, pulling out words that you know you can develop for depth that they'll see and hear again. So I'd be looking at what's challenging about each article and thinking about how you can pull out a lesson. You know, maybe a little bit of a pre-lesson, a warm up, and then, you know, embedding application throughout the article. Okay, I love that you to them and you're telling them that they can think. I worked with middle school, as I said earlier, really where I was a special educator first. Yeah, it's hard. And then I went to high school. Yeah.
Well, and they just get put in intervention after intervention, and it just doesn't seem to go anywhere. And my husband hasn't questioned the daily Amazon book delivery yet, but I'm sure it's coming. But you know, I've gotten Anita Archer's Rewards, Morphine Magic, The Writing Revolution. This comprehension blueprint is an overlay to article of the week. And I mean, like, I've got a freight train full of heck yeah for next year. I hope it all.
All right. Well, try to integrate it and take a little bit on at a time. One bite at a time. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. You're welcome. Anyone else have any comments or questions for this evening?
I have a question.
Sure.
So the leveled readers that are out there and the comprehension assessment that the teachers have to give for the leveled readers and for the kids to move up a level and a level. Right. I am a tutor and I just read so that these kids could read and enjoy reading and love reading and want to read a book. And they are, but in the back of my head, I'm like, are they going to make it for these assessments on the leveled readers? Do you know about the assessment and the comprehension part of the leveled readers?
Well, the leveled readers are not really written to develop these processes and skills that I'm talking about. And so, you know, if we're coming from a place where we recognize that you're not going to get that product unless you develop these processes. And what happens to kids very often on is they get stuck in certain levels of the leveled readers, and then they don't have access to the academic language to, so they're not written for this purpose either. You know, so I think, you know, it's a battle, no doubt, in terms of what we should be using for students. But if your kiddos are in leveled readers, if you have an opportunity to enhance and elaborate on maybe topics that they're talking about, but enrich your language, go for it. Or if you're reading to them, perfect, okay? Because that listening comprehension, until they can get that word recognition piece in place, is so, so important.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
And have conversations about the vocabulary, pull out the challenging sentences, you know, make sure you're asking questions at different levels. Yeah, build some background knowledge with them. Have a lot of fun with it.
And that's exactly what I'm doing. And thankfully the parents are okay with what I'm doing. And we kind of like, let's just keep going. Some of them, my kids are reading and loving reading. I'm like, you know, and it's like I'm having a book club with, you know, a second grader, and it's exciting. And those leveled readers kind of just.
It's not what they were written for. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's why as the kids graduate out of those, they get them into chapter books, don't they? Right.
If they're ready, if they can do it, you know,
they're ready. Yeah. But meanwhile, they get stuck. Yeah.
Well, and when they're assessing them, Eliza, it's all about, are they substituting words? And if the word they substitute is okay, well, then that's fine. Because they're not reading, they're not having the kids read for accuracy, they're having the kids read for meaning. You know, so there's a big difference. So they're making up the words as they go along. And like someone said, the test is about retelling. You know, are they understanding? And most of our struggling readers have pretty good comprehension, in spite of the fact they can't decode.
Can't hear. We just lost her.
So,
Yeah.
okay.
We lost the last line. Donna, can you just repeat what you said? Your last sentence, we lost you.
I said they're testing them about the whole, can they retell the thing even though they can't read the words? That doesn't matter, because it's all about, can they, if they substitute a word, you know, I don't know, horse and house, then they criticize them. Okay, well, you're not understanding, but they look at the errors, the MSV errors. And then there's inconsistency in levels. That's true. The levels mean absolutely nothing.
Very good point. Really great. Thank you. Yes.
So it's frustrating because it's not really testing comprehension. It's not. It's how they can guess.
Yeah, I see a quick question. How is process different from strategy? Strategy is the means to the end. All right. So activities and strategies hopefully help develop skills. And I think Danielle McNamara said it well. Strategies made automatic, in fact, are skills. And I often think about processes as skills. So you might use drawing or visualizing to help a student acquire a knowledge of word meaning, for instance, but that knowledge of word meaning, the semantics, the vocabulary, that has everything to do with the language process. Okay.
One last one. Do you have specific activities for inference or figurative language that you like to do?
Yeah, so so I do have I do have a structure for inference. I think one of the things for inference is one has to be thinking about, first of all, does the student have the background knowledge that's necessary in order to infer? You can teach a lot of strategies for inference, but if they don't have the background knowledge, as I like to say, you can do it till the cows come home and it won't matter. So I think that making certain they have the background knowledge and then questioning and helping them make connections back to the text itself through your questions. So this is what the text says. What do I know about that particular thing? You know, that question from the text. And what does that then tell me about this? So yeah, making those kinds of connections, always going back to the text and then helping them to surface their background knowledge and then helping them to make a connection between the two. And again, the inference chapter does have, all of the chapters have informed structures for different types of instruction. For instance, inference instruction in that particular chapter. I could talk to all of you forever here, couldn't I? Yeah, okay.
I think we're good.
You have great questions, really.
I think it gives a nice overview of what your book is about. So,
Well, that was the intent for this evening, was to kind of do the highlights from chapters 1, 2, and 3. And I realize so you all have some specific questions that I'll try to answer when I talk about vocabulary and syntax, and then maybe you can send me some questions afterwards that I can help
That's
you
good.
out with. Yeah, okay.
all right, everybody. Are you good, Nancy?
I'm good. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for a really enjoyable evening. I can't believe I'm still awake.
There you go.
We're
Me
all still
too.
awake.
I'm getting a
Stayed
little sleepy. All right. I
Take
will
care.
be
Thanks.
getting all this out to everyone. I apologize again. All right. Thanks, everyone. Good
Thank you
night.
for your hard work.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your hard work, Donna, getting this to us.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Melissa. I appreciate that.
Okay. All right. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Nice job, Nancy.
Oh, thanks, Donna. Thanks for doing this.
You're
They
welcome.
asked some great questions.
Oh,
and
I know.
almost
Good work.
want to give them more and more and more, you know.
Oh, I get it. All right. We're all good.
All right. Talk to you on
Night.
Thursday.
Sure,
Bye-bye.
sure thing. Yes.